Welcome to part 5 of The Abolition of Work, an essay by Bob Black. These videos are all now being organized into a single playlist on my channel and will make the most sense watched in order. In this video, we are, more or less, at the halfway point of the essay. Luckily for me, it seems that the essay starts to take some more time in the actual conditions of modern work in the 80s, and starts to rely less on the theoretical foundations for rejecting work. As a result, although Bob is still very rigorous in what he says, it's much easier for me to comment. I can react to his work without having to figure out 50% of his references first. I hope you are continuing to enjoy my coverage of this essay. Quote, "The aspiration to go backwards or forwards to a life without work is evident in every serious social or cultural history of pre-industrial Europe. Among them, M. Dorothy George's England in Transition and Peter Burke's Popular Culture in Early Modern Europe. Also pertinent is Daniel Bell's essay, Work and Its Discontents. The first text, I believe, to refer to the revolt against work in so many words, and, had it been understood, an important correction to the complacency ordinarily associated with the volume in which it was collected, The End of Ideology. Neither critics nor celebrants have noticed that Bell's End of Ideology thesis signal, led not to the end of social unrest, but to the beginning of a new, uncharted phase, unconstrained and uninformed by ideology. It was Seymour Lipset, in Political Man, not Bell, who announced at the same time that the fundamental problems of the Industrial Revolution have been solved, only a few years before the post- or meta-industrial discontents of college students drove Lipset from UC Berkeley to the relative and temporary tranquility of Harvard." Close quote. This paragraph had me scratching my head, Googling. You'd think with so many years of education, I'd have some familiarity with popular intellectual trends, but I guess an MBA doesn't actually prepare one for having a curious and active mind. Surprise! Here is an overview of the references in this excerpt. Mary Dorothy George, 1878 to 1971, was a British historian best known for compiling the last 7 volumes of the catalogue of political and personal satires preserved in the Department of Prints and Drawings in the British Museum, the primary reference work for the study of British satirical prints of the 18th and 19th centuries. You know, just in case you have some time on your hands for a little light reading, based on the online descriptions, George apparently reaches some truly fascinating conclusions as a result of those 7 volumes. I couldn't find much on her book, England in Transition, other than some notes that mention her belief that the Industrial Revolution doesn't have a beginning or an end date exactly, but the process is simply ongoing. Ulrich Peter Burke, born August 16, 1937 in Stanmore, England, is a historian and a professor. The book referenced in the excerpt, Popular Culture in Early Modern Europe, is apparently a very influential book in the history of culture. Without reading these books, and due to the lack of synopsises available online, I have to speculate what exactly Bob is referring to. It seems there has been a desire to return to an earlier time in history before enforced industrial work existed, or a desire to progress forward to a time when we are free of mindless, numbing work. I think what this seems to suggest is that a 300-year backlash against anything points to some inherent flaws. Daniel Bell, born 1919, died 2011, was a Harvard professor and a sociologist who wrote a collection of essays published in 1960 under the title The End of Ideology. Pretty dangerous title to use, just as bad as I don't know, the end of history? Bob describes the book as complacent. The overall theme of the book is how the great ideologies of the 19th century through the early 20th, including things like Marxist socialism, fascism, and so on, had been exposed as destructive and monstrous, result of the Stalin purges and World War II and so on. Ideologies have, as a result, lost their ability to generate the enthusiasm that made them so attractive to earlier generations. This book has been ranked among the top 100 nonfiction books published since the Second World War, according to the Times Literary Supplement. But Bob and other thinkers have pointed out that the very first essay in that book, Work and Its Discontents, is different than the others. In this essay, and it is surprising given that Bell was generally conservative, we are warned against the cult of efficiency that has left workers, quote, like mythical figures of Ixion, chained forward to the endlessly revolving wheel, close quote. In this, Bell is more careful and more prescient than his contemporary Seymour Lipset. While both were prominent thinkers, generally favoring a less moralizing intellectual pragmatism, Bell saw the motivation, the upcoming trend that would drive the rise of the hippies and the student rebellions of the 1960s. These countercultural rebellions stood resolutely, but not ideologically, in opposition to mainstream authoritarians, and against the materialistic work culture of earlier generations. This reference to the hippie subculture is quite interesting in the context of this excerpt. First, Bob establishes that anti-work sentiment has been a strong historical theme of early modern culture. Then he shows how centrists, or conservatives, were becoming complacent, especially in the middle of the 20th century, believing their ideas rule the day. Suddenly, boom, you get a very strong anti-work, pro-play, pro-experience, pro-environmental, pro-egalitarian, pro-pleasure movement erupt in the 60s and change everything. And this reaction is very much a reaction against a parent's generation, and particularly against their empty, materialistic motivations. Quote, as Bell notes, Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, for all his enthusiasm for the market and the division of labor, was more alert to, and more honest about, the seamy side of work than Ayn Rand or the Chicago Economists or any of Smith's modern epigons. As Smith observed, the understandings of the greater part of men are necessarily formed by their ordinary employments. The man whose life is spent in performing a few simple operations has no occasion to exert his understanding. He generally becomes as stupid and as ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. Here, in a few blunt words, is my critique of work. Bell, writing in 1956, the golden age of Eisenhower imbecility and American self-satisfaction, identified the unorganized, unorganizable malaise of the 1970s and since, the one no political tendency is able to harness, the one identified in HEW's report, Work in America, the one which cannot be exploited and so is ignored. That problem is the revolt against work. It does not figure in any text by any laissez-faire economist, Milton Friedman, Murray Rothbard, Richard Posner, because in their terms, as I used to say on Star Trek, it does not compute. Close quote. In this excerpt, Bob has changed the focus of his critical ire to economists. He starts off with Adam Smith, 1723 to 1790. He was a Scottish economist, philosopher, pioneer of political economy, and a key figure during the Scottish Enlightenment. He's also known as the father of economics or the father of capitalism. He's often cited by laissez-faire pro-business types, But what is especially hilarious about this is that Smith was no proponent of modern neoliberal extremism. This is made clear in the excerpt that by using a work-related quote shows Smith was much more in line with Aristotle than with Milton Friedman. Bob also talks about Ayn Rand. If you're unfamiliar with her, I do cover ideas in episode 14 of this channel. Frankly though, she makes me slightly nauseous. Bob groups Ayn Rand with the Chicago Economist, naming Milton Friedman specifically. Ayn Rand is intellectually bankrupt. However, Milton Friedman is quoted as calling her an utterly intolerant and dogmatic person who did a great deal of good. Whereas Milton Friedman was a very intelligent and I think decent man who did a great deal of harm. In Naomi Klein's book Shock Doctrine, Milton Friedman's work is exposed. He was a free market prophet and willing to be extremely unethical in his applying of his beliefs. Klein writes the following about Friedman's involvement in Chile's 1973 military coup of a democratically elected government. Quote, after the coup and the death of Allende, Pinochet and his Chicago boys did their best to dismantle Chile's public sphere, auctioning off state enterprises and slashing financial and trade regulations. Enormous wealth was created in this period, but at a terrible cost. By the early 80s, Pinochet's Friedman-prescribed policies had caused rapid deindustrialization, a tenfold increase in unemployment, and an explosion of distinctly unstable shantytowns. They also led to a crisis of corruption and debt so severe that in 1982, Pinochet was forced to fire his key Chicago boy advisors and nationalize several of the large deregulated financial institutions. Close quote. Pinochet led a coup that not only instituted free market reforms, but also became very busy with torturing, killing, and various other horrible acts of totalitarianism. Yet, and at the same time, Pinochet's government was directly and actively advised by the economists of the Chicago School. Bob's ultimate point in this excerpt is to criticize the cultural and economic trends of the mid-20th century. He links this critique to the malaise of the 1970s and to the Work in America report. In 1972, the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare released results of a study into work and concluded with a report that said, quote, 6 chapters examine and discuss 1, the functions of work, noting that many adults not only lack the opportunity to work, but are generally dissatisfied with jobs which fail to keep pace with changes in workers' attitudes, aspirations, and values. 2, the effects of work problems of discontented workers who feel their work is not challenging. 3, the physical and mental health costs of jobs. 4, the keystone of the report, which is the redesign of work to allow workers to participate in decision-making processes affecting their lives. 5, worker self-renewal programs which allow for additional education and training. And 6, the federal policy in relation to the creation of jobs, manpower, and welfare. Although the report does not contain a summary list of recommendations, there are implied recommendations. Close quote. So despite the stupid optimism of some of our most influential economists who believed in unfettered capitalism that will create the best conditions of life, there is ample evidence that our current work life is shit. That was not a fact ignored by the father of capitalism, writing almost 200 years before these supposed economist geniuses. But it is a fact that we can't ignore. Bob points out that Friedman, Murray Rothbard, who also was an economist, and Richard Posner, a jurist and economist, all ignored the social costs of their proposals because it simply didn't fit with their dogma. They had already decided that neoliberal free market and minimal government policy was the best way to a better world, and they were not going to let any silly facts get in the way. Quote, if these objections, informed by the love of liberty, fail to persuade humanists of a utilitarian or even paternalist turn, there are others which they cannot disregard. Work is hazardous to your health, to borrow a book title. In fact, work is mass murder or genocide. Directly or indirectly, work will kill most of the people who read these words. Between 14,000 and 25,000 workers are killed annually in this country on the job. Over 2 million are disabled. 20 to 25 million are injured every year. And these figures are based on a very conservative estimation of what constitutes a work-related injury. Thus, they don't count the 500,000 cases of occupational disease every year. I looked at one medical textbook on occupational diseases, which was 1,200 pages long. Even this barely scratches the surface. The available statistics count the obvious cases, like the 100,000 miners who have black lung disease, of whom 4,000 die every year, a much higher fatality rate than for AIDS, for instance, which gets so much media attention. This reflects the unvoiced assumption that AIDS afflicts perverts who could control their depravity, whereas coal mining is a sacrosanct activity beyond question. What the statistics don't show is that tens of millions of people have their lifespan shortened by work, which is all that homicide means after all. Consider the doctors who work themselves to death in their 50s. Consider all the other workaholics. This excerpt is pretty clear. Even when work fails to drain our desire to live, it may yet succeed by actually killing us. I was curious about how the statistics had changed in the 35 years since Bob wrote this essay. I'd assumed with the decline of manufacturing in the US and increasing awareness of workplace dangers, people should be doing safer jobs than they were in 1985. I expected to see some decline in the statistics, but no, in fact, it seems to be an increasing problem. The rate of injury due to work has increased by as much as 60% versus 1985, and at the same time, the total US population has only increased by 40%. A quick scan of the numbers indicates that some of the highest rates of injuries are not a result of what we would consider dangerous jobs. The highest rate of work injuries at 15 injuries per 100 workers per annum happens in skilled nursing care facilities. Apparently your granny is a killer, and not to make light of it, but if I look at exactly the same statistics for correctional facilities, so jail guards and so on, it's only 9.2 per 100, and the grouping of justice, public order, and safety work, which I assume includes the police, is only 6.3. Honestly, I find that absolutely shocking. Why do we never hear Fox News praising courageous nurses with the same Todd-worshipping sycophancy that they offer anyone who carries a badge and a gun? Anyway, I think that's probably long enough for one video. So with that, I'm going to conclude episode 23 and part 5 of this essay. This was a section that was very close to my heart, as I've always been quite interested in how economic history affects social change. And while the second half of the 20th century wasn't always pretty, it was always pretty fascinating with enormous economic and social change and huge conflicts, particularly around economics, although the neoliberals definitely won this one. I hope you enjoyed the video and don't feel too assaulted by the overly complicated language. Please subscribe if you'd like to be notified when I release part 6. This is XCG wishing all of you downward slopes and the wind at your back on your journey to freedom.